Hey everyone, today we're going to be taking a good close look at these two Cerwin Vega speakers. I've got with me here today a set of VS-120s and AT-12s. These are two very similar speakers. The AT-12s came out in 1987, I believe, and the VS-120s being released in 1992. My Cerwin Vega VS-120s were manufactured in August of 1996, and the AT-12s were manufactured in April of 1994. We're going to be taking a good close look at the outside, and then we're going to crack these puppies open, take a look at the inside. But we are going to put all the components side by side once we get them all opened up, and we're going to compare the two, just see how different they are. So before we take a close look at them, I'm just going to go through a few of the specifications. Both of them sporting 12-inch woofers and having a sensitivity rating of 97 dB. The VS-120 is rated at 4 ohms, and the AT-12, from the specifications that I was able to find, they rated it about 6. They measured the AT-12 mid-range driver a 5-inch cone and the VS-120 a 4-inch cone. I don't really understand that because they both appear to be very similar, so we'll take a close measurement once we get them out. And then sitting on top of the mid-range drivers, we have the tweeter, both 1-inch tweeters. The big difference between these two, the AT-12 does give you the ability to adjust your high range and mid-range levels right on the front. Super easy. You can personalize it, whatever you think is best. In my opinion, the VS-120 does sound a little bit better on the high end, although you cannot adjust it. The AT-12, when the level meters are balanced out in the middle, it does seem a little more dull than the VS-120, but it's easily corrected. Just grab those dials, crank them up, and there's nothing wrong with the way they sound. There's also slight differences in the crossover points between all the drivers in each speaker. The VS-120 has crossover points of 300 Hz and 6000 Hz. The AT-12 has crossover points of 400 Hz and 3000 Hz. Now, with some of the boring details out of the way, let's take a closer look at the outside of each of these speakers. So there's not a whole lot to go through in the front of these. It's pretty obvious. Very simple design. I love the big rectangle, old school box style floor standing speaker. I'm a big fan of it. I wish they made more speakers like this nowadays. To me, this is what a speaker should be. We have our 12-inch driver, 4-inch mid-range, and 1-inch tweeter. There's not a whole lot to go through with the front of these. So let's turn them around and see what we got on the back. Now, on the back side of these speakers, we got what I love, 2 big rear-mounted ports. These things put out some bass, and everybody considers these things party speakers. Very commonly used party speaker. They're very loud, even with a cheap old amplifier receiver. I mean, 100 watts is more than enough power to make these things sing and get really, really good sound out of them. Why I love the VS-120 probably the most is because, yes, they sound very good with 100 watts into them, but you start pushing the power, getting closer to 200 plus, even 3, I've put up to 600 watts into these puppies, and they take it. The reason I pushed so much power into these things is I don't gotta worry, because if they do cut out on me, pull out and down, you got an overall speaker fused protection system. So you drive these things too much, or you push the amplifier, it starts clipping, this little guy's gonna pop, it's gonna save your speakers. I am not as fond of the fuse holder in the VS-120s. I think the AT-12's got a little better fuse holder, it's just a little more secure. I have had a few issues, especially now, we're in 2022. You know, this speaker is 20-some years old, things start to wear out, it is plastic, and I've had them vibrate loose, all of a sudden you have one cut out, think you blow a fuse. Go to the back, pull it out, fuse is fine, and you just find out all you gotta do is push it in just a little bit more, but they do tend to vibrate these out. That is one of the drawbacks to the Cerwin Vega speakers. When you get into the 12 and 15-inch models, they've taken lots of power, there's lots of vibration going through these things, and they almost self-destruct themselves. I've had issues with the crossovers, the components coming loose on the inside, thinking a mid-range driver doesn't work, and I take it apart and test the mid-range driver and it's perfectly fine, pull the crossover out and find that components that have actually vibrated off of the crossover. But the best part is If you're handy with a soldering gun, pretty easy to fix. Now let's move on to the Cerwin Vega AT-12. Again, 12-inch woofer. They, in the specs, like I said earlier, are calling this a 5-inch cone mid-range driver. They look very similar in size. I highly doubt that there is an inch difference between the AT-12 and VS-120 mid-range drivers, but we're going to get a closer look later. And then 1-inch dome tweeter on the top. And here we have your mid-range level control and tweeter level control. Now the big difference visually, other than obviously having the level controls on the AT-12s, the AT-12s came with a ribbed paper cone. Also visually, you're going to see we've got a little more detail in the front. I do think that is maybe a little better looking speaker. And even with the grills on, these are a good looking speaker. I know personally, I've had some issues with the AT-12 cabinets kind of rattling and falling apart. Not necessarily falling right apart, but you start to get a rattle in the cabinet without, really looking into it. The first thing you're going to think is maybe you blew a speaker. But then after a close inspection, you actually find that the cabinet is actually starting to fall apart. I've not had that happen on the VS-120s. Not saying it doesn't happen. I personally never had it happen, but I have on the AT-12s. One of the bigger issues versus the VS-120 and AT-12, you've got one more thing in the face of the speaker that's cut out. So you've got more holes. So it is going to make this front face of the cabinet just a little bit weaker. They do have bracing in here, and that's one of the things I found that comes loose. The glue gives out and you start to get a rattle. It sits, I believe that brace sits in here, right about here somewhere, and it goes from the front face of it to the very back of the cabinet just to sturdy this whole thing up. Like I said, these speakers are 20 some years old, these being 28 years old. After all those years of vibration and getting moved around and carried around to parties, right? They're a party speaker. Eventually, sometimes that glue lets go and you're going to start to get a vibration in there. Again, easy fix if you're handy enough. Nothing really too much to worry about. Now we get to the back side of the AT-12. Very simple, same style banana plug speaker terminals in the back. And like I mentioned before when I was talking about the VS-120s, I do like the fuse holder a lot better on these than the VS-120s. These are threaded in, they're not going to vibrate loose. You're not going to have any issues with it. There's apparently a lot of threads on it. And I have not looked at these yet to see what style. Oh, and it has the proper 2.5 amp slow blow fuse inside, which is good. Never put bigger fuses in. These are here for a reason, especially if you got big power and you're putting big power to them. I have gotten these speakers in before. You pull them apart and you'll have a blown fuse with tinfoil wrapped around it. That's not going to help you protect anything. So, like you've seen on the VS-120, two big 4-inch rear mounted ports on that guy for the 12-inch driver. This thing still sports a 12-inch driver, but it has, I think this is about, I think I measured it, it's maybe 2 3/4 of an inch. We'll just call it 3-inch single rear port. I don't know the big reasoning for that, but all I know is they're the ones that designed it. That's the way it's supposed to be. Don't go cutting holes in these things. I've literally gotten speakers before where there's been holes drilled into it. That's not going to enhance anything. They were designed the way they are for a reason. Other than that, very plain. The one thing I didn't mention on the VS-120, on the back of those speakers, they did continue the black wood grain vinyl wrap on the back as well, whereas the AT-12s, you can see the particle board, this is just painted black on the edges, and the back of this has some sort of black laminate on it. It's the back of the speaker, you're never going to see it anyways. But again, I feel like there was a little bit more put into the VS-120s than the AT-12s. So now that we got to take a good look at the front and the back of these two great Cerwin Vega speakers, let's crack these things open and do a little comparison on the drivers inside. Well, now that we got it up on the counter, we're going to start taking it apart. We're going to pull out the woofer, the mid, the tweeter, and we're also going to pull the crossover out. And we're going to take a good look inside, see what's happening in there. So now that we got all the drivers out of the cabinet, we're going to take a good close look. I'm going to show you a couple of things I was talking about prior. One thing I did forget to mention when I was taking everything apart, if you're ever doing that yourself, always make sure you note which wire was hooked up to which component. They usually have red wire going to the woofer, yellow wire going to the mid, if equipped, and blue wire going to the tweeter. There are some models that they come from the factory and they are hooked up in reverse polarity. Pretty much every Cerwin Vega I've ever taken apart is always marked which is positive and which is negative terminal on the drivers. But there are some models that come from the factory with usually the tweeters, maybe sometimes the mids, hooked up in reverse polarity. This is not done, this was not a mistake made by the manufacturer. A lot of times the tweeter is going to be hooked up in reverse polarity and that ends up being corrected in the crossover network. So always make sure you know which one goes where. If you have to, take some tape, wrap it around there, mark it, and then there's no guesswork. And then you know your Cerwin Vegas are going back together the same way that they were put together in the factory. All right, so let's take a good close look on the inside. So on the AT-12s, you're going to notice where your speaker terminals hook up to, your crossover is not connected to that speaker terminal. In most cases they are. This one just has the fuse holder for the overall speaker protection on the back side, and then there are wires coming off of the crossover in purple running to where you have your mid and high level adjustments to. That's actually where the crossover is connected to. Now, like I said before, I was mentioning how they were braced. Now this is right from the factory, this is how it's done. And these are 28-year-old speakers. And if you look up here, there is glue on it. They got glue on the bottom and the sides. On the top there is none. Now this glue is very hard, it does break apart over the years. All the vibration in these cabinets, sometimes this brace piece here will come loose and it'll start vibrating. Just like most of their cabinets, 3/4 inch particle board construction, and then you've got your baffling, insulation, whatever you want to call it, all put on the inside. I've seen some pretty funny things done. I had a set of D1 Cerwin Vegas actually. When I opened them up for the first time, they had the baffling, it was still rolled up and just set inside. Some goofy things happened in the factory. I don't know why. But never hurts to open them up and see what you got going on inside. Again, this is another thing. I've seen these come loose. I doubt it's going to happen with this guy. This one's very, very well glued, as you can see. Anyways, not a whole lot to go through on the inside of these. Pretty basic. Now that we've taken a good look at this, let's get into that VS-120. Now the VS-120 on the counter, let's do the same thing. Start pulling out all the drivers. So already now with the VS-120 pulled apart, first thing that you're going to notice, they've actually got this grooved out for the woofer. This is grooved out in the perfect size for the die cast aluminum basket. It sits nice and snug in there. I do like it. It's a nice smooth look. The way it's kind of countersunk in there. Also you'll notice here, I'll get you guys a closer look here in a bit. The mid-range section is actually separated from the rest of the cabinet, and they've got it insulated. My best guess is that these have been pulled apart already. Usually the wires for the mid-range are also siliconed and sealed off. These wires are sealed through the hole they have in the separate enclosure for the mid-range, and these have already been pulled apart. And if you look, I'm not sure why, maybe there was a cut in here. We got some electrical tape, but that's fine. So let's get you guys in there for a closer look. All right, let's take a look inside and look what we found. You know, I called them party speakers. There's a Pilsner beer bottle cap inside. I wasn't kidding. These were party speakers. So inside you can see, you take a good look at those two big 4-inch round rear mounted ports. Same as AT-12, same sort of baffling on the inside. But you will notice on the VS-120s, they've actually got it. See, I've never seen one of these down. Usually these have been opened up before. This is usually stapled up here, and actually attached back here, like so. They've actually got the portion where the woofer sits closed off with the baffling. The AT-12, it was all open, the whole cabinet. We're going to pull this back down, take a look. There's your separate chamber for your mid-range driver. One of that reasons being is if we just go and take a look, this is the mid-range of the VS-120. The mid-range driver does have an open style cage or a basket to it. So they insulated the inside and separated the chamber for the mid-range for that reason. So the vibrations from the woofer isn't going to affect the sound being put out by the mid-range. It's nice to see. And if we take a look at the mid-range from the AT-12, it's got a closed basket style, so not really a big deal. Also taking a look at the inside, very well braced, even better braced. They've got 2 braces on either side, and they've also got one running across, which also supports the separate chamber for the mid-range. And the crossover all being attached to where the speaker terminals are, your fuse holder for your overall fuse protection, just a little different style. These are a little more involved at taking everything right apart. And as you can see here where I said, usually the wires are glued or siliconed in to hold them into this, and get you guys in there, into this chamber. These have definitely been pulled apart before. Not sure why, but I know these work, so not a big deal. We're going to staple that back up, I think, before we put her back together. So other than that, not much more to go through. Same 3/4 inch particle board construction as the AT-12. So like I said, very, very similar speakers. So now we've got the 2 woofers side by side. You guys already know the visual differences of the outside or the face of these, of the cone. The AT-12 uses the rib cone, like I said. They also use a larger dust cap size than the VS-120. VS-120 having smooth paper cone and a little smaller dust cap. We're going to flip these guys around, upside down, and do a comparison on the baskets. Well, not really a lot to talk about here, is there? Very identical. Basket, both die-cast aluminum baskets. I'm going to call them the same. Realistically, there is really no difference between these baskets. So not a whole lot to talk about here. Both great woofers. So on to the mid-ranges. And like I said, they in the specs call this a 5-inch cone, and they're calling this 4-inch cone. I don't see a huge difference. They're both around that 4-inch size. I don't know where they're getting the 5-inch size here. Maybe there's something I don't know, but I'm going to call these the same. Both have wire mesh grills to protect, and they are very lightly glued onto the stamped metal baskets here. Sometimes they kind of come apart, not a big deal. You can glue them back on if you want, or when you're putting them back in, line it all up, tighten the screws up real well, you'll never know. Let's flip them around. We kind of already took a look at these. Closed basket style on the AT-12 mid-range. The VS-120 being a open or vented style basket, I guess. And, you know, little different terminals on here. These are riveted or screwed onto the basket rather than pinned on like that. It doesn't make much of a big difference. Magnet size, they're roughly about the same. I do want to say though, it's almost like there's a little more weight to the AT-12 mid-range. But very, very similar speakers. I'm sure most aren't going to tell a big difference. Now we move on to the tweeters. Here's where you're going to start to see a difference. So we've got a 1-inch dome style tweeter with the wire mesh protection, just like the mid-range. Flip her around. That's a nice big beefy magnet on that guy. And there's some weight to it. I think, in my opinion, I think this is a better quality tweeter in the AT-12. Move on to the VS-120. You know, similar size from the outside. They appear to be the same size, but when you flip this guy over, it's a little weak. Still a great tweeter. I do love the sound of these. I really do. But I don't know for sure, but I'm going to say my best guess is you're going to be able to pile a lot more power into this guy than this guy. Although I've never had any problems with either. But both speakers are equipped with a self-resetting high frequency circuit breaker. So I've never blown a tweeter up on a Cerwin Vega. If you do, you're probably underpowering them. I like to put 200 watts into these. I think the amp I usually run these on, I'm about 350 watts. So I've never had any issues with the tweeters. And you know what? They both sound great. They're both loud. But I'm going to say the AT-12 has a little beefier, probably a better power handling tweeter. I could be wrong. There's a good weight difference between the two. The AT-12, it's much heavier. Having taken a look at all the drivers, the difference of the AT-12, having your mid and your tweeter controls are attached, the pots in this back here, with the rest of the crossover design. I'm not going to pull the one out of the VS-120. There's no point. It's very similar, minus your controls. Obviously, there's different components used. The crossover points are a little different, like I spoke about earlier in the AT-12 than they are in the VS-120, but the VS-120 has the same design crossover. So there you go. That's the inside and outside of the Cerwin Vega AT-12s and VS-120s. I hope this helped you guys out if you're trying to make a decision between one or the other. In my opinion, buy them both. You can't own too many Cerwin Vega speakers. There's no such thing. But until the next video, remember, Cerwin Vegas, big or small, save them all.